In grief, we experience pain, and pain changes people. Pain always changes people, and pain is not going to look clean or rational or composed.
Welcome to NICU Heroes, a podcast produced exclusively for NICU professionals, with me, Kathryn Whitaker, as your host. I'm the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit dedicated to providing free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a baby's NICU stay. As a NICU professional, you've been well trained to care for the tiniest and the sickest babies every day. While a NICU parent's scars are not as visible, those parents are often as fragile as their babies, requiring patience, guidance, and encouragement to ensure that they are mentally, emotionally, and physically prepared to endure the pressure of a NICU stay. NICU Heroes is dedicated to helping NICU professionals like you better understand, support, and nurture the entire NICU family. Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to NICU Heroes. I'm so grateful that you're here. We have another excellent guest. And another topic I think that maybe doesn't get a lot of press. To be honest, I haven't heard many podcast episodes that focus on the chaplaincy program and grief. And so that is what we are going to dig into today. I have an excellent guest. J.S. Park has been actually a guest over on our other parent-focused podcast, NICU Babies Parent Support, and I loved him so much that I knew that he would be an excellent guest for NICU Heroes, specifically for NICU professionals, and understanding what is it that a chaplain does, how can they be a part of our integrated care with our patients, and how can we have this better relationship with them. So, and I think the way that you do that is by understanding what it is that they do, how they can be a benefit to your patient. And also, I think many of the things that JS is going to share in our interview are going to help you be a better NICU professional, because they may help you may help give you some perspective on certain situations that you're like, that's what I can do. That's what I can say or not say. And this is how I can better serve my patients. So I know that you're going to love today's interview. My guest today is J.S. Park. You'll hear me in the interview refer to him as June. But J.S. Park is a hospital chaplain, a published author, and an online educator. For 8 years, he has been an interfaith chaplain at a 1,000-bed hospital that is designated a Level 1 trauma center. His role includes grief counseling, attending every death, every trauma and code blue, staff care, and supporting end-of-life care. He also served for 3 years as a chaplain at one of the largest nonprofit charities for the homeless on the East Coast. JS has a Master's of Divinity completed in 2010 and a BA in psychology. He also has a 6th-degree black belt. He is the author of The Voices We Carry, Finding Your One True Voice in a World of Clamor and Noise, and As Long as You Need, Permission to Grieve, releasing tomorrow. JS currently lives in Tampa, Florida with his wife, a nurse practitioner, and his daughter, newborn son, and adopted dog. And so with that, let's have an amazing conversation. Well, I'm more than honored to have a really great, excellent chaplain here today. We have so much to talk about. J.S. Park is my guest today. J.S., thanks for being here.
Kathryn, it is good to see you again, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you.
You know, I hope it's okay. Can I call you June? Can we do that now?
Yes, family, friends, colleagues, you're more than welcome to do that, of course.
Okay. So officially, everyone else can call you JS. I'm grateful that I got promoted to June today. So you are someone that I started following on social media because you had such good, balanced, I think, perspective on grief and chaplaincy. And that is not something that I had seen often. And so I think that's really where I'd like for us to start is how were you led into the chaplaincy program? And how do you think it's changed you since you started as a chaplain?
Yeah,
I know those are two big questions.
No, I think I entered chaplaincy like a lot of other chaplains have. I began in pastoral, like church ministry, went to seminary, went into church ministry for about 7 years total, and always felt like an oddball looking in through the window from the outside. And church ministry requires a very special type of person. And I don't know if I ever really had the thing that I needed to do it, to navigate some of those boardroom conversations, and I wasn't as crafty as some of the other leaders. And so it sounds like I'm downplaying the church. There's a lot of pastors that they're doing amazing work, but I know that it wasn't a fit for me. And right before I got married, I actually was in a church that was kind of healthy, and I decided to go. And I actually got married without a job, and then, which of course, for my wife's parents,
was going to say she was probably like, I'm in love with him. It will all work out. Her parents were probably like, jobs, income,
yeah,
this is good.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I was willing really to work anywhere, but it was actually my mother-in-law who encouraged me to hold out and wait. That it's
Mm.
okay. You have some saved. I had the privilege to be able to, be okay for a little while. And I had heard about chaplaincy from actually this short stint I did for prison ministry. And there are chaplains who work in the prison system.
Right.
And what I had heard chaplaincy is a pastor that works outside of the church, especially and particularly in crisis and in urgent situations. So I looked into it after I got around the time I was married. I started to look into it, and the training was very long at the teaching hospital where I'm still now working. It's a 6-month internship, and then if I'm lucky to get
Wow.
in, a year-long residency. And so
So you had to apply, June, is what you're
I had
saying.
to
So you had to go
apply,
through the
and
training.
it's a
Okay.
very high bar. It's a very narrow gate to get into chaplaincy. And the interview was tough. It was unlike any other interview I've ever been in.
I bet.
Because it's they don't ask really for a resume. They make sure you have the degrees and stuff like that, but they asked for like a 3-page life story. And I think one of the first questions they asked in the interview was, "How did your parents' divorce affect you?" And I thought,
Wow.
are they allowed to ask me this? And they said something like, and then when the friend at church, the leader, hurt you and talked bad about you behind your back, how did you handle that? How did you feel about that? Not just handle that as in like an HR type of way, but
Right.
they wanted to know how I dug into my own grief. What was
Oh,
my approach to grief and to pain? I can tell you this, Kathryn, when my first clinical, that first week in my internship, I accompanied a physician. I was with another chaplain who I was shadowing. That chaplain got called away to another emergency. So it's just me as an intern in my first clinical with
oh
this
my gosh.
physician. In the emergency room, we went into a private waiting room and we broke the news to this family that their loved one had just died in the ER.
Oh,
And wow, the grief was, of course, loud and very hard. There was a family in that big family in that waiting room, and the care and comfort that I offered, at least the little that I knew how at that time. By the end of that visit, I knew that I belonged in that room.
wow.
And it was such a different feeling than the 7 years that I had worked in church ministry. And I just hope that every person listening, if you can find that place where you feel like you fit, you belong, you've been called into it, where something clicks, it's almost not definable, but at the same time, you know it when it happens. That clicked for me, and I knew I wanted to go all the way.
Well, I'm struck by the moment that because I think sometimes people may hear that and they would say like, I am definitely not equipped for that. I definitely can't do that. So what a gift not only to you but also to that family that that was a clarifying moment for you. Like I know what my gifts and my skills are, and then this opportunity allowed me to see those. I think from a bird's eye view to be like, okay, I am in the right place, doing the right thing. I think that's something that we all strive for. But I also think it's the qualities that make a good chaplain of knowing when you can be present to someone and when you can't. So I think that must have been a beautiful moment. Incredibly hard, but also poignant, I think might be the right word that I'm looking for. So I know that you mentioned a little bit about church work. So some people may not have a full understanding of how or what the difference is between a pastor versus a chaplain. Because I think sometimes people hear chaplain in the hospital and they think like, Oh, I would only be able to call that person if I go to a church or whatever. So maybe explain to people what the difference is between a pastor and a chaplain.
Sure. The quick and easy way that I can tell you the difference, and that's a great question. A pastor acts often as someone who imparts information. So they may be more of a preaching person, someone who takes care of their congregation for the long term. They're in a ministry that provides and offers theology. And of course, there's counseling there, but they're long term with a congregation in a particular location. So if a pastor preaches, a chaplain is a presence. And we need our pastors. I feel still, as much as I've been maybe harmed in the church, I still have good thoughts and feelings about church ministry and their needs and their place and where they belong. But I would say a chaplain is a presence in that I don't enter into a room thinking I am going to be providing theology or giving a sermon or imparting information. I'm not persuading this person into anything. Or I'm not asking them to join or be recruited into some sort of congregation. Instead, I enter into a room as a presence sounding board, being able to receive the venting or the frustration or the pain of my patient. And I assume that patients who have questions often also carry their own answers. And so I'm not proselytizing. I'm not trying to convince them into any sort of framework. Instead, the framework that they have, maybe I can hold a candle to the floor and light the way for them just a little bit more. And chaplains, at least in the hospital that I work at, we have a range of different activities, including advanced directives. So we assist a patient with filling out a form for healthcare surrogate in the case that a patient can no longer make decisions because they don't have that capacity. Who would they then like to make those decisions for them, for consent and for permission, essentially to act on their behalf? And then there's the living will. Now, the living will came about in Florida, at least because of the Terry Schiavo case.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, some people may know about her. I think it was the early 2000s, where the parents, and I believe it was her significant other, who had a conflict about Terry Schiavo, who had a TBI, traumatic brain injury, about whether to keep her sustained on life-prolonging measures, machines, or to quote unquote let her go. And the significant other wanted to let her go. Parents wanted to keep her. So ever since then, the living will is a document that says, here are my wishes were I to ever be incapacitated and on life prolonging measures. And chaplains assist with that. Not many people may know that. I know in some hospitals, social workers do that. But in our hospital, they have chaplains do that because it is a very difficult, critical conversation that's not just a legal, technical form, but also requires a discussion about mortality, about frailty, about autonomy. And those are spiritual and emotional matters. And then we attend every single death. We help with what happens next after a death. I work also in the emergency room. So every single trauma that comes in, I'm in a level 1 trauma center. And that means gunshot wounds, car accidents, fire, fall, stroke, drowning, electrocution, anything that's a level 1 trauma, burn, stroke. When they come in, I have two main roles. One is I identify who the patient is and reach out to family. Because, the emergency team, they're all kind of swirling, lots of activity.
Right.
But I'm sort of the person that's going to connect patient with their community. And then if the patient is awake and alert, I can offer care and comfort when there's a moment to enter in. And then, of course, when the family arrives, I'm going to offer care and comfort to them the best I can. And I often escort family from front door to bedside. As a whole long process. It can take a long time. And so when a chaplain makes that phone call to family, that's not always the best phone call. But at the same time, when I make those phone calls, I'm doing my best to give the news in a way that is going to help as much as I can this family who is now in shock to receive this news, deliver sort of a cushion or a buffer or a presence that this is hard news that I have to give you, and I'm here with you 100% to help you from where you are to the front door to bedside. And then if you need me past bedside, I'm staying. And often, nurses and doctors, of course, if they had time, they would step away to make that call. but they can't always. In fact, most of the time they can't. So I'm there to do that. And we help with like end of life assistance, like making decisions about end of life, whether that's a family making decisions or the patient. Those are difficult conversations that are not just about procedures and machines and numbers,
Right.
but also have difficult questions, religious and spiritual in nature, that sometimes the physicians and the nurses will sort of say, we got to call a chaplain for this,
Right.
because there are some families who maybe the machines, they're, this is a whole other conversation, but maybe for the patient, it might be better if they made a certain decision regarding the machines, regarding the life prolonging measures that the family's finding very, very difficult to make. Is resuscitation the right thing to do? After 3, 4 times, after 5, 6 code blues, should we keep going? And I'm not there to convince the family, oh, it's okay to let them go, but rather let's talk through that. What is it?
Right.
What does it look like to
Yeah.
readjust our expectations? And the physicians and nurses we have, they're fantastic at that work. And chaplains come alongside to sort of answer those difficult spiritual questions in between the procedure and the person. And so it's such a wide range of activities we do. Chapel services, if somebody wants to get married, we can do that at bedside. If somebody needs grief, comfort, and crisis care right in that moment, we can basically fly to that room. Sometimes I one time got a call. This has happened actually more than once, where I'll get a call, 6K, somebody's screaming, can you come up here? And then they'll hang up.
So you handle the screaming
Yep.
calls
So
too.
I
Yeah.
handle those too. I'll run up and handle the screaming. But chaplains are called for religious and non-religious reasons. I don't necessarily bring up religion unless the patient does or if they want to. But I'm there to assist a lot with decision making, with the crisis care. We attend every single death and trauma. And I guess the clinical, technical definition of a chaplain is we are a non-anxious, non-judgmental, comforting presence.
Well, I know that families, I mean, I can speak from experience and that we've had many interactions with chaplains, both when our son was in the NICU, but also when my dad was in the ICU just before he passed away. And I think that I mean, as I'm listening to you talk about this presence versus preaching, I mean, I absolutely see the presence part of it. I'm curious, JS, because you were visiting about all the things that you do. I mean, what is the hospital chaplaincy training like? Like, how do they walk you through, this is how you are present to a family? This is what you do in this kind of situation. Is it more on the job training? Like, give us a sense of what you have to go through training wise to be an effective chaplain and also to protect yourself as a human being.
Absolutely, yeah. So in the internship and in the residency, we had a cohort. I think in the internship, there were 4 other interns, the residency, 4 other residents. And the training was a split between clinicals on the floor and then direct training that we would receive from our supervisor and educators. And then we had group time where we would reflect with each other and offer each other feedback. And then we would do something called verbatim, which is almost like a book report, but we write it about a patient encounter. And really, a lot of the training from now looking in hindsight, a lot of it was just digging into ourselves and our own stories, our own pain and our own grief. Because, healthcare providers, mental health professionals, we all enter in with our own stuff. You know, here's this patient, they have this swirling satellites of just lots of different voices and people and opinions and decisions. And we enter the same way. And a lot of our training was about how do we actively listen? How do we tune into where the patient is? Every time I enter a room, it's a different planet. So how do I acclimate
Yeah.
myself to their environment? And so some of these trainings were like probably some that you would expect, like cultural sensitivity or the active listening. We also learn family systems and dynamics because when we enter into a room, a patient is often surrounded by their family, whether that's family of origin or chosen family. They have a lot of people around them. And so sometimes there's different opinions that collide and in
Right.
conflict. And as a chaplain, I navigate a lot of those kind of conflicts where sometimes the patient, their voice is overridden by family in their lives. Because family, when they see their loved one hurting and in pain, they have this impulse to fix it, and it's good intent, but not always the best method. And so,
Sure.
what can I do to bring out or to make safe in the room for this patient to be able to express themselves, often to their elders or people who are telling them what they need to do? And then there was a whole unit on family dynamics, and we dug into our own family tree. And Kathryn, that was
Ooh,
real tough work.
I bet it was.
I didn't realize how hard it would be after every one of those sessions, those group sessions that we did. I was always fatigued. I would involuntarily weep just thinking about my own family history and the difficulty of the abuse that I endured and some of the things my own family endured. And then we did a lot of work on trauma and what is now, I think, being called trauma informed care. We did a lot of that where we don't assume a person, it asks a question, not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you, or
Oh,
which place are you coming from? Kind of seeing the causes and stimuli that maybe brought this person to this place, rather than assigning blame or morality to it primarily. Instead, seeing that person within their story and the context around that, and maybe some of the systemic and traumatic causes that brought them to that point. And
right.
so a lot of it really is about how do we more and more see a patient as a whole person rather than the list of symptoms. Now, the numbers and symptoms, those are incredibly important. Those are vital to life-saving care. But care is holistic, meaning there's spirit involved. There is a person's value system involved. There's their entire network, their community involved. And a chaplain, I think, in some way, the divine work that we do is fleshing out a person, is to be able
Mhm.
to say, this person has an entire story. How do we backstory them and front story them? How do we get the whole story out? And in that way, I think that kind of care is better. It's going to be. It's by default,
Sure.
just by with us knowing more, the history, the story, what's valuable to them. And not only that, but patients will, and I've known this because I've been a patient, we do feel better about our care when we feel like we are heard. So much
Yeah.
of what I deal with is I'll see a patient and they're anxious about their own care because, for one, they don't know everything that's going on. And for two, they don't feel like they're being heard about their symptoms or about their pain. And so, chaplains, we are trying to validate their pain as much as possible. So we do a lot of training on that as well, about how do you hear a story? How do you pick up on these little things where they're saying this for a reason? And then in some way almost act as a translator or interpreter with the care team,
Yes.
right? And so
Yes.
that's why in California, they passed that law that all palliative care teams now have to have a chaplain, because a chaplain can give voice to that. And it's not that
Yes.
nurses or physicians can't, but sometimes there's a specialty or a hyper focus on here is the physicality of this or the physiology of what's
Yeah.
happening. So it can be very difficult sometimes to see the whole picture. And that's why we have specialties. So a chaplain's specialty is whole making, it's person making, it's fleshing out. And if I start to ascertain and assess that there's an information gap, that's what's causing this anxiety, I will try to get the care team involved and say, this is what the patient is hearing. And then sometimes the
Yes.
nurse or physician, they'll say, oh, I already told them that 5, 6 times, and then I'll say, well, maybe there's a different way that we can tell them, or there's just a key missing piece of information, or there's a clinical or medical phrase that is not being communicated. Because, communication isn't just what we say, it's also what's heard. And so even if the nurse or physician has gotten with this patient 6, 7, 10, 12 times, and they're thinking, I already told them this, there's something that's not connecting. So how
Right.
can we completely deliver that to them? And if information gap can be closed, anxiety is alleviated. I've seen it 9 times out of 10.
I mean, I remember there was one time, JS, that I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. Sometimes and I'm thinking about NICU parents in the sense that while our child is the patient, we are really the ones that communicate with the chaplain, with the specialist, whatever. And I do remember there was one time that I looked at the nurse and I was like, I they knew us so well because we spent so much time up there, and I was starting to feel overwhelmed, and yet another specialist was walking in the door after yet another test with more bad news, and I remember she looked at me and she said, "Would you like me to call a chaplain?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Is it that bad? Like, is the news that he's about to give me that bad?" And she said, "Kathryn, I think that you might be overwhelmed and maybe you just need someone else to be here."
Wow.
And I was grateful that the nurse saw, like, I think this specificity that you were talking about, it's not that my nurse couldn't do all those things for me,
Hmm.
but she knew, like, this is my role as the nurse, and I think maybe someone else can come in and sit with Kathryn so that she can hear this news and not have to worry about, "Did I miss all that? Did I hear?" And I remember that chaplain was so good about saying, like, "Let's talk about what else do you need to know?" And I think you're right. I think we fear, like, if a chaplain walks in the room, that must mean it's bad news. It's not always. It's just it's overwhelming and chaotic. So to have someone who's, like, in your corner, which I don't think I realized chaplains could play that role, that
Yeah.
that was a key part of what they did, and it was so healing for me. But I didn't, of course, didn't realize that until months, years later. But looking back, I think, man, that was a gift that that nurse gave me that I had no idea that I needed.
Yeah.
So
Even having a
I'm grateful that
stranger.
you miss.
Yeah. Having that
Yeah.
presence, like you said. I mean, there's that concept of the intimate stranger, somebody that you may not know, but
Yes.
just having a person there and they're vicariously experiencing with you the pain that you're going through. That's so meaningful and can be definitely
Yes.
healing and encouraging in itself. Specifically with the NICU, there is a level of with that information gap, the anxiety. Because I remember my wife and I, with our first child, we had to do this procedure where my wife asked the physician, "Is this going to hurt our child?" And the
Mm.
physician said, "Toughest thing about caring for babies, they can't self-report. You know, there's that opaque wall of we just don't know, and
Right.
and we assume it probably is going to hurt and it is going to cause some trauma." But there's an extra opaque level of frustration because there's just that wall of not being able to communicate fully. And so for babies, for NICU, that's a whole other difference. Very special, it takes an incredible gift and skill set to do that because you got to be super in tune with how a baby reacts and responds. But yeah, that's a level of anxiety that it's an extra level of anxiety, I would say, that
Yeah.
really requires special care.
Right. I remember there was this one time that we had a family member, when you were talking about family members surrounding the bedside, we sort of knew what was happening, but someone walked in, friend of ours, and kind of started freaking out, which freaked me out. And I remember, for whatever reason, the chaplain happened to be there, and he was like, I don't know how he did it, but I remember looking up and being like, "Where did my friend go? They are no longer in the room." Like, he realized,
Mm,
like, "Hey, this is freaking everyone out. Let's see if we can't mitigate this so that we can bring some calm back in." And then they just sort of disappeared. When she came back, she was better, and I was like, "I don't know how that just happened," but it was such a it was such a gift because it was the escalation was going pretty high, and I remember thinking, "I'm not sure that I would have known how to handle that." I was dealing with my own stuff, and so to have to manage someone else's. So I can imagine if you have a patient who either can't talk, or maybe they don't feel like they can, that a chaplain can be a real benefit in a situation like that,
yeah,
and you don't
absolutely.
even know it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know we talked a little bit about what you can ask of a patient. I wanna dive into a little bit about grief
Mm,
and how people respond to grief. Sometimes, June, like in a NICU setting, it may not necessarily be an end of life issue, but it may be a life altering issue. Like, maybe a family's getting news that could change the life of both their baby and their family. And then sometimes it's the worst news that they're losing their baby. I think sometimes we assume that there's certain normal reactions that people may have to hearing hard news or devastating news. Maybe give people a sense of, and I hesitate to say the word normal, what are appropriate responses to grief? Like, when should a nurse look at that and say, "Oh, this is normal, this is appropriate," or "This is concerning, we should do something about that." Like, give people a sense of what responses, like, how people respond when they hear something like that, and what's concerning and what's not.
yeah. And Catherine, feel free to jump in anytime. I'll give you a shorter answer and you can kind of pause me anytime and ask a question about it. But, grief is normally defined as our response to loss. And sometimes in some dictionaries, it'll say our natural response to loss. But what is natural and what is normal, right? That's the
Right.
question.
Yes.
And I think when I entered chaplaincy, my idea of what is natural and normal was pretty narrow, confined by theology and my worldview, my ideas, including Hollywood and pop culture,
Right.
but it has since expanded. And so we may think of grief, the response to loss, as crying, sadness, somber, hanging head. But there's also extreme reactions to grief that I've now seen, and I keep seeing new ones that I've seen like screaming, shouting into the air, cussing out God, rolling on the floor, dancing and clapping and singing and rocking back and forth. And then there's other reactions that look like they're not reactions at all, but numbness, fatigue, cognitive fog, shutting down. I've seen, especially younger folks, sitting in a corner, losing themselves in their phone, just trying to escape into a digital dreamscape.
Right.
And I would say that these extreme reactions of emotional expression and these seeming non reactions of shutdown, these are valid expressions of grief. We see an entire range. And my box of what grief looks like, and we all have a box about that, it keeps
We do.
breaking down and expanding. And I'm trying to be more and more comfortable with the discomfort of seeing what grief looks like, the sounds that we make, the words that we say, or sometimes even things that look completely unintelligible or unreasonable to us. You know, I can tell you two stories. There was one where I saw a room that they were around their loved one, this whole family. And as their loved one was dying, they sang songs for a long time, just songs. And the way that they were singing was almost like they were happy, like they were singing at church.
Mm-hmm.
And someone looking in through the window might have been like, how can they sing at a time like this?
Mm-hmm.
But this was what was pulling them through. And this was their way of honoring their loved one. And this was their way of expressing grief. I saw another patient who, it was a young baby who had died, and the mom also had some complications. She kept her very, very young child, her baby, in the room with her for more than several days. And there are questions about how long is it okay? Is it safe to keep that baby who's died in that room? And each day that passed, the physicians and nurses kept deciding, let's let her have the baby in there. And I think it was probably 7 or 10 days that she had that baby in there. Now that's a while. That's a long time. And I don't know if they can prescribe that for every patient or every hospital. But
Right.
that was the reaction. That was her response to loss, that she just needed to have this baby by her, even though her baby had died. She needed her there to mourn that loss. Now, what I've seen from grief is that there are things that work for us, and there are things that just emerge from us. Things that work from us, we make a conscious decision to say, this is how I'm grieving. And I think we also need to have grace for, here's what emerges from us, things that we almost can't control, involuntary responses, whether that's shouting or laughing or rolling on the floor or hitting a wall. So these responses, I have more and more now, having been a chaplain almost for 9 years, having a little bit of ring experience.
Yeah.
I'm continually expanding my box and making more and more room for these responses. And sometimes the callous way that I've seen people talk about grief responses, oh, they're just putting on a show, or, oh, how can they act like that in a time like this? Or they just need to be composed and calm, or they got more decisions to make. They just need to, they need to wake up. They need to, et cetera, dot, dot, dot. In grief, we experience pain, and pain changes people.
Yes, it does.
Pain always changes people. And pain is not going to look clean or rational or composed. And I think it's upon us who are alongside the bereaved. How can I best guide this person along, balance myself being a presence without pushing this person towards a conforming reaction that I would expect them to have, or to push them into a reaction that I think they should have.
Push them into a reaction that makes you feel better or
Makes
safer,
me feel
right?
comfortable, right?
Right,
As if I'm soothing myself out of my own discomfort from seeing their pain. How can I
right.
be in their pain and hold them, but not hold them down? And I think I'm continually expanding that room. And that's a tough and ongoing work to do.
This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit, but we're more than simply a podcast. Hand to Hold is here to support your NICU in two ways. One, you can refer your NICU parents to us for support, or two, you can bring dedicated Hand to Hold support to your NICU, either in person or virtually. Our support consists of one-to-one group and educational resources, including our family-focused podcast, NICU Babies Parent Support. For more information, visit handtohold.org and click on NICU Professionals. Well, to that end, June, I'm wondering, because everyone's reaction to either hard or devastating news varies, obviously, but I'm curious if there's things that people should absolutely not say, or things that other people may find comforting. And I know that may vary from family to family. You may have the benefit as a chaplain of either maybe knowing that family or seeing some of their family dynamics, or maybe you're walking into the room for the first time. But I'm also thinking about maybe the nurse or the NICU professional who's in that room and maybe knows that family. What are some things, at least in your experience, when people have said, you're like, do not say that. That's the worst thing you can say. Or when someone did or said this, it was very comforting in a moment of deep grief. What would you suggest to people?
Yeah, first I should say everyone grieves differently, just as we need differently. So what may not work for one person could work for another, and vice versa. But I really try to stay away from moralizing and prescribing types of information. So I don't want to ever push a person into a feeling or into a theological conviction. And I don't want to prescribe anything for that person that's going to push them into deciding something. And so some theological prescriptions or phrases, and we know some of these things like, everything happens for a reason, or it was
That
God's
one's
will. Yeah.
those are the worst. Can I just
Yeah.
don't ever say those? Yeah.
And these days
Those,
when somebody says that to me, I'm just like, oh yeah, what reason specifically? If you can walk me through that, can you tell me
yes,
exactly
please.
what reason?
Because
Yeah.
I can't think of any right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Worst
Yeah.
thing. Definitely
Yeah.
don't say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, this is God's will to refine you in the fire, that kind of thing. Or everything will work out in the end. You just be strong, or God's got this. Now, some of these phrases and these theologies could be true. Some of them can be
Sure.
helpful. But speaking spiritually, sometimes out of our own discomfort, we may see a person in pain, and the good intent here is, I want to help this person and assist them
Right.
and support them. When I used to hear these kind of phrases before, I would be outraged. But after, 8, 9 years, I've come to have a lot more sympathy and empathy for people who use these phrases. Because what I've seen, and the phrase comes out like this, but what I see in their eyes is, I really want to help this person. And this is what I know. And this is just my gut instinct to say this. This is all I can offer. And it's silent. And when that abyss of loss opens up, it's like I got to offer something into this sudden
Yes.
vacuum. So there's
Yes.
that gut instinct to try to fix. But what ends up happening is, if spiritually or theologically speaking, we may take what we believe is future hope, what the story of scripture may say or their religion may say, we may take future hope and pull that eschatological curtain over present loss. And we insert that future hope in the present crisis, thinking that it'll somehow help. When actually all it does is it hastens and rushes this person to a conclusion that they're not ready for, that they may not be ready for until the other side of glory, right?
Right.
So there's that instinct to want to do that because it's like, what else can I offer? When really, actually, there are two things you can offer. You can offer being present in their pain, and you offer yourself. You offer yourself. You are more than enough to be in that person's pain. People don't think so. People think I may have to come up with some right combination of words, some magical secret phrase to unlock this person from their pain, but really don't need to do that. Really, what they need is you. You're the miracle they're praying for. So I think that instinct to say those kinds of clumsy phrases comes out of a good intent, and also maybe a feeling of inadequacy or fear, or maybe self-soothing, some sort of instinct to say, oh, I'm uncomfortable with pain, so I got to also close the gap for myself because now I'm
Right.
suddenly faced with loss and mortality. But instead, it's enough to say, let's get uncomfortable. You can enter into that pain, sit in the boat and in the river with them, this terrible, awful, awful river that they're now in. Sit in the ocean with them, these roaring waves, and you are enough as a presence to be there. You're the one that they want, not these clever phrases, not these, wordplay, not things you put on a coffee cup. They really just want you.
It's so true. I know I mentioned that hard day that we got that news, and I remember Beth, our NICU nurse, came in, and I was just sobbing. It was the worst. And Beth just sat next to my chair. I was holding our son, and she just handed me Kleenex after Kleenex after Kleenex. She didn't say one word, June. She just sat there. And later, I mean, I remember thinking, I think in my mind, I was thinking, oh, Beth said all these things. But when I look back, I'm like, no, Beth just sat next to me. And I remember feeling so seen. Like I didn't want someone to say something to me. And on the opposite side, there may have been someone sitting in a similar situation who would have wanted someone to say something. But Beth read the room well, and she just sat next to me. And I remember that presence meant a lot. So every time we see her at the NICU reunion, I give her a big hug because I said in the moment that other people would have said something, you were just present. And
Yeah.
I think that we sometimes discount how important our presence can be when really there's nothing that you can say that makes it go away. I love the way that you worded that. I'm going to end it there because I love the way that you said that.
Yeah.
So if a chaplain is not around, June, what's something that a NICU nurse or a NICU professional can be for their patient if a chaplain can't be there? Are there things that I guess that they should know or be aware of when they're serving their patient and their family that they can aid the situation rather than cause more harm or more trauma to that family?
Yeah. I say this as essentially a layperson outside of, medical and clinical knowledge. I've picked up some from osmosis. My wife's a nurse practitioner and has her doctorate, and she does wound care. And so there's some stuff I picked up, but I think even my wife will say this when she goes to see her patients. There's there's sort of a technical, clinical. Here are the symptoms. Here's the treatment. There's all this planning that's very, very physical, physiological. There's like anatomical stuff involved, but something will switch, and the person will start talking about, I've been having a hard time lately. My dog is getting old, or this wound is not letting me do the things I used to want to do. And then they start talking almost not based on the treatment or the diagnosis, but around it.
Yeah,
And what my wife always does is she may be done with a patient's care in 6, 7 minutes, let's say, you know, 15 minutes. But she has sometimes talk with a patient for another 20, 30 minutes, given that she has time to do that, if she has
sure.
time. And that is also part of treating a person. That is also part of offering care. And I know that it's a whole other conversation about our systems being stretched, and sometimes the ratios are not good at all.
Right.
We've seen the same news reports how in New York, sometimes it's like, what, 14-1, which is just, that's really wild.
It's intense.
Yeah.
It's a lot to put on one.
I
Yeah,
can't even imagine. I mean, I used to work in a restaurant as a busboy. I can't imagine having 14 tables,
right.
you know,
You would be
much,
getting no tips if you had
no,
14 tables.
not at all. you know,
Right.
yeah.
And these are humans who are going through, in many cases, traumatic, life-changing events. And so you're trying to
Yeah.
serve that many. That's a lot.
Yeah. And I've been on the NICU floor a lot, and every one of these NICU nurses are incredible because they will spend time with
Yeah.
the family, the extra minute or two. And that really counts. That really, really counts. It's not just the hands-on care that's involved and spending the extra minutes for that, but it's listening to the story, or it's being there for the story around the injury and the illness and the wound. So I think I follow my wife as an example. She's a hero to me, and the way that she, spends sometimes maybe twice as long as she would on the actual treatment itself, just listening to the story. That is what can make a person better. That
Sure.
is part of the healing. And so I hope that there's not, I think it starts internally with understanding there isn't really a compartmentalization between here is this injury that I'm treating physically, and then here is all the pain that this person is experiencing due to their condition and in their own life and the stresses that we all go through. That's all a part of it. So I think we need to see it as the whole pie, as the whole picture. And then as much as we can to try to listen. I think it's Dr. Atul Gawande. He wrote Being Mortal, one of my favorite books. I've read it many times now.
Have to write that down. Okay.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. And I've also watched the documentary. I went on this Atul Gawande, like I became a fan and just I stalked all of the podcasts that he was on and listened to all his
Love
interviews.
that. I've done that too. Yeah.
Yeah, but he's a surgeon and then he started to get into end of life care. And so Being Mortal, I think it's the subtitle is What Matters Most in the End. I think that's what the subtitle is. Is amazing. He's an amazing doctor, but he says in one part of his book where he says if he talks more than 50% of any visit, he knows that he did not do a good job as a physician. He says if he talks more than 50% of the time. And so what does that mean? It's he says he has these like questions that he kind of goes through and questions that maybe we're all now familiar with because we've gotten good training, but things like, what are you understanding about your condition? You know, how are you feeling about your care right now? What would help you to feel most autonomous in yourself in this moment? Those are important questions to ask. And so there's the care around the care that isn't just around the care, it is also the care
It
itself.
is the care, though. I mean, being seen on your hardest day is what we all desire. We all want someone to enter in and see us and be present. And so to have questions directed towards that end, I think can make a big difference. June, you mentioned earlier that part of your training was being aware of people's different cultures, different backgrounds.
Yeah.
And I know that at hospitals, it's not like they're looking at, what your income level is based on we're either going to allow or not allow a chaplain to come into your room. But how do you address I know you said some families may have or some patients may have many families around, but then there may be some patients who have no family around. So how do you make sure, June, that you serve those patients and I guess not allow bias to enter into the picture, but to serve them as equally and as best as you can based on their specific situation?
Yeah. Catherine, that's an amazing question. I'll try to take it from maybe a big picture angle. The thing that I think often, because I get patients from all kinds, we're in a safety net hospital, meaning we don't refuse anyone due to insurance. So we'll take anybody. There are patients that sometimes I'll hear murmurs where oh, that patient is here because they did something wrong. There's a moralizing kind of around why they're there. There are patients who, may be abusive or they get labeled as violent and aggressive and non-compliant, non-adherent, things like that.
Right.
And then there are families that we may blame them as well. And certainly a lot of these things have validity to them, about families being abusive or a patient being abusive and so on, or maybe they got themselves into the situation somehow. We also get convicts, people who are handcuffed to the bed and things like that. The main thing that I always think in all these kinds of visits, if there is some sort of judgment involved or something where something can be blamed, I guess, is I'm always thinking I am responsible for this moment. I am just responsible to my patient in this moment. I don't want to judge anything that happened before. I mean, it's impossible. We enter in with our own bias and baggage. But as much
Sure.
as I'm humanly able by the grace of God, I don't want to judge this person based on their past. I had more than one patient. Chaplains are in this very unique position where we'll hear things that patients feel comfortable saying because they see us as some sort of maybe confession type figure. It's safe to say this,
Right.
but I'll hear patients say the hardest things about stuff they've done in their life. I had several patients tell me that they've hurt someone or killed someone, and they're confessing this to me.
Wow.
And what can I say to them in that moment? Can I, there's a part of me that thinks there's a lot of judgment there.
Right.
And then there's another part of me that's like, I am just responsible for my patient in this moment who is in pain right now. So, what is a way that I can hold this in a way that I'm not enabling them, or I'm not saying that this is okay, but I am seeing them as a person who they're confessing to me this very vulnerable thing, or I should say, they're confessing to me vulnerably this very hard and perhaps maybe even evil thing that they did. How can I hold space and hear them and see them as a human being? That's hard, Kathryn. That's never easy.
The hardest, I would imagine.
Yeah, yeah. But that's the kind of slogan or motto or refrain or mantra that I say to myself is I can only be responsible to my
Right.
patient in this moment right now.
Well, I mean, I think it's a mantra. I mean, at least this one specialist, one day, one diagnosis at a time mentality that I think a lot of NICU families are reminded of. Like, don't think about, as you were saying, what happened before, what may happen after. Like, we only get this present moment. So let's stay focused on this present moment, and then we'll take the next moment and the next moment. I mean, that was certainly the mentality that we operated on when we were dealing with big news, but I can see how it can also benefit if you're in a excruciatingly difficult situation. Okay, so we're just going to take this moment, for the one that's given to us. But it's hard. It's easy to say that, but I know that it's hard. If there are, I think, a situation, I know we kind of touched on it a little bit, where you may move from nursing to chaplaincy. And I know we were kind of talking about the full circle of care, like what that care really looks like. When, June, would it be a good time for a nurse to say, now it's time for me to invite the chaplain in? Like, you might you be able to give people some suggestions of, okay, so if I'm having this conversation, I'm doing this full care with this patient, and then I start to realize, oh, that might be a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Now I need to call the chaplain. What, maybe give us an example of when it might move, since I know you're married to a nurse practitioner, what it might look like. And to do that transition well, not for that patient to feel like, oh, now I'm getting passed off to this person, but you've basically extended what I can do professionally for you, and now I want to invite someone else who can serve you in a different way, but also in a beneficial way.
Yeah, I can answer this on two levels. I think one is I would think locally at each hospital, how are chaplains integrated into the system? So the hospital where I work, we are really, really well integrated to the point where nurses know exactly when to call for us. And sometimes we're called for things that, they'll say help, for maybe for things where
Right.
they're like, oh, this is a kind of a gray space. I'm not sure. Like earlier I was saying, I've gotten calls where they're just like, somebody's screaming up here, in 5A, can you come up? Yep, I'm there. Yeah. So they know to call us very specifically for advanced directives, for every death that happens. Next of kin searches, we do those as well. So if somebody comes in with no family or a family has abandoned them, then we keep going down the line. We become almost detectives in a sense. But we are so well integrated into the system that we're at that we know exactly when to go, and nurses know when to call us. And we get consults. So when we log in, we get consults that pop up around the hour. I mean, sometimes dozens and dozens a day. And so we are a resource that is well known and fortunately very loved throughout our hospital. But I think it's really important that each hospital locally understands how do we integrate a chaplain into our system. Like when we do admissions in our hospital, I'm in a 1,000+ bed hospital and it's growing. When they do admissions, they always ask, that kind of battery of questions. And one of them is, in your hospital stay, would you like to see a chaplain? And they can say yes or no. And if they say yes, we get an admission referral, and then we go see that patient and check in with them.
Okay.
So in that way, they're sort of less awkward, rather than just in the middle of a moment, somebody says something.
Right.
Well, maybe a chaplain can,
Right.
then that's kind of,
You've done a little background
yeah,
work. That
yeah,
makes
yeah.
sense.
Then it's less like handing off or, just pushing them away a little bit. But
Right.
I think a nurse can discern maybe at the end of a conversation, or as sort of like in between thinking, maybe this patient really could see a chaplain. I would say it's probably better to wait. One thing that I think of that's a really great exercise for anybody to do is the box of tissues exercise, which is, when do I give a box of tissues to a person? That's a very tricky thing to figure out. Because if I
Hmm.
push it too soon, it's almost like I'm saying, like, wipe your tears. I don't want to see them. But then
Right.
some people need tissues. And does every person need a box of tissues? Do I put it in this middle space between us almost as like a, hey, this is here if you want it, you don't have to use it? Do I offer it every single time? And so for nurses, whether that's like getting a therapy dog or, calling for psych, things like that, there's some of these departments or specialists where it requires a lot of discernment and very, very, very being in tune with, when do I pull in, when do I pull back? And I think that a chaplain is the same way. And so there are times when I've felt, I work with amazing people, but there are times that I felt that I was called in maybe too quickly.
Hmm.
And there was one instance I remember where I walked by a room and the nurse said, "Hey, chaplain's here, patient. Hey, so and so patient. Do you need a hug? The chaplain's walking by." And I thought, that's, hold the cards a little closer to the chest, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah, a
a
little bit.
little.
That's
Yeah,
really, the patient was like, "No, I'm fine. That's good." Almost like,
I'm good, man.
yeah,
Just
yeah, I don't want to be hugged by bad news or something. They gave me that look like the chaplain. Oh my gosh.
right.
Yeah, so there's that sense where that was too soon. That was almost like throwing a box of tissues at somebody.
But that's a great
That's
analogy though,
it's
June, that
helpful for me, yeah.
it's well and nuanced in that when you have integrated care like that, and I know that there are more and more hospitals moving to this family-centered integrated care, which I think is a great benefit, not only to the people giving the care, but to the people receiving the care. But that it's almost like there's a little bit of a seamless transition from specialist to nurse to chaplain to social worker. They're if they're all a part of the team and they're all getting to know that family, they all sort of know when to press in, step out, and I think that comes probably with some experience too, that you have good mentors and also experiences for you to say, "Okay, we could have done that a little bit differently." It was a little it's like when you start to ride a bike and you're like, "Okay, maybe we need a little more practice," but I can see how that the line starts to get blurred a little bit, and that some rooms you may step in a little earlier, some rooms a little later based on what you know and the coworkers that you work with. I would imagine that it's a good encouragement for everyone to symbiotically look at everyone that they work with and say, "How can we all support each other instead of how can I just do my job well?"
Yeah, yeah, and I think defining those options is super important too. Like, being able to say, well, here's what they do. Here's what this person does. Here's what they can do for you.
Right.
And they're not going to push this or push that. Sometimes we hear a certain treatment or chaplain or something like that. And we're just like, well, what is that? What is that going to do for me? Or what does that mean for me? Is this bad news if you're going to ask for the chaplain for me? Yeah.
Exactly.
Or, oh, yeah, even hearing the word palliative for some people is like a huge, yeah,
Yes.
that's a huge, that's very alarming. So I think defining those terms, also just the education on how do we integrate into the system in a way that we're offering this option that is safe and that it doesn't necessarily raise alarms, but here's more care that we can offer.
Oh, I like that. Here's more care that we can offer. That's really good. So I'm going to ask you to dream a little bit.
Yeah.
So if you could, maybe in the next decade, what would be your dream, your hope for the hospital chaplaincy program, June, and how you serve your patients?
Wow. Dream for hospital chaplaincy care. I think, you know, maybe just what I was saying a little bit ago about the defining our role and educating not just the hospital system, but patients about what we do. That's a small ask, I think. But my dream would be that in 10 years, people know exactly what they're asking for when they ask for a chaplain, that our roles are clearly defined. We're not necessarily a therapist, we're not necessarily a pastor, we're not necessarily bad news, but we're there as a presence and we can fit in the in between. And there are technical roles that we can take on, like the advanced directives, the next of kin search, deaths, but really we're there as a presence to sit with you as long as you need. And I think that really requires the hospital system, and that requires nurses, physicians, and chaplains to sort of lend ourselves and say, here's exactly what we can do for you, and we want to do this for you. I was watching this TV show. This was probably a couple years ago now, but there was a chaplain on this TV show. And I thought, this is the first chaplain, maybe besides MASH, but this is the first.
Oh, yeah.
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 This is like one of the first chaplains I've ever seen in a TV show. And the chaplain started talking to the lead character and started saying, in the name of Jesus, if you just believe in his salvation. And I thought, that's that's so far.
If only they could have had a consult with an actual
that would have
chaplain,
been
right?
great.
Yeah.
And I thought that's so far from what a chaplain does. And that's not a chaplain. And I thought, yeah, it's Hollywood pop culture and all of that sort of gives an idea of, what a pastor wants. And I don't blame them. Maybe that's just what they see a religious figure as. And so they, narrowed it down to that stereotype. But I hope, within some years that I'll see in a TV show somebody differentiating, like, do you want me to call the chaplain for you? Chaplain, why do I need that? Oh, it's not because they're going to preach at you. They're not a pastor or anything like that. But they're here to hear you and to be with you and to sit with you and to navigate some of these difficult things that are happening.
Well, that's why I had you on here, because I feel like it's a misunderstood specialty in the hospital, and and sometimes I think underutilized, and maybe sometimes overutilized, but in the wrong way. So I wanted to give people an idea of how you can be a presence, and a really important one at that. I would be remiss if I did not ask you about your book that launches tomorrow. So tell us a little bit about your book and where people can find you, and all those things.
Yeah. So the book is called As Long as You Need, subtitle Permission to Grieve. And that is I would say it's 3 parts. It's like part memoir, part hospital chaplain journey, and then part guide through grief. And so there's hospital stories in there, details changed, of course, and there's stuff about me growing up. And then there's lots of little sort of things woven about grief throughout it, whether that's poetry or spiritual, emotional, relational research. And that can be found on through all my social stuff, but aslongasyouneedbook.com. And that has the list of all the retailers that it's at. And very happy that I got to narrate the audiobook this time as well.
You have such a good, soothing chaplain voice, so I was so excited to see that you were narrating it. There's something special and unique, I think, about the author reading their own words, because you know what they mean, and you say them the way that they were intended because you were the one that wrote them. So I'm really glad that you were the one that narrated it. Well, I can attest, I do think it's a beautiful blend of helping people understand what the role of chaplaincy is, how people grieve, and then getting some perspective into why you share what you do, because they get to know you. So I think it's beautifully done. So I can attest. I've read it. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
But June, thank you for being here, and thank you for all your wisdom and helping people understand what the role of chaplain is and how they can better serve patients.
Kathryn, thank you and for having me here.
Thanks, y'all, so much for listening. That was a fantastic conversation. I hope that you'll do me a favor. If you love today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can also review over on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. You can also give us a listen and a watch over on YouTube. It's how we reach more NICU professionals. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Reckitt Mead Johnson, whose mission is to nourish the world's children for the best start in life. For more than a century, they have led the way in developing safe, high-quality, innovative nutrition products and continue to push the boundaries of nutritional knowledge with consistent, strong investments in scientific exploration.